It's early 1942, and on the beautiful shores of Oahu, Hawaii, the wreckage of Japanese aircraft floats gently in the waves. In the port of Pearl Harbor, there is carnage. Just months prior, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack with an aerial armada. Now, the mighty Pacific Fleet of the US Navy lies in a scorched, tangled ruin. Littered around the harbour are the towering hulks of once proud battleships, now half sunken and capsized. Over 2,000 Americans, civilian and military, have been killed. The Japanese Navy proudly reports a decisive victory. By their account, 21 American ships have been damaged beyond repair or outright destroyed, never to fight or sail again. But they are wrong. From the day of the attack and into the next year, an epic salvage operation was undertaken that would see all but 3 of the American ships repaired and put back into service. This saga would push dive teams and engineers to their absolute limits, working deep inside the hulls of the devastated warships that still contained the remains of hundreds of their trapped comrades and friends. Exposed to toxic gases, jagged and twisted steel, and shifting, unstable wrecks, these men worked despite the enemy's perceived success. It would not be an easy job, and there would be some shocking discoveries in store. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the true story of the most epic salvage mission of all time. This is how they salvaged the wrecks of Pearl Harbor. This is an extremely rare Japanese newsreel film, probably made around mid-December 1941, reporting back to the Japanese public about a monumental victory. A task force of Japanese aircraft carriers had launched hundreds of fighters, dive and torpedo bombers into the air, a massed armada of aircraft with a single target, the US Naval Station at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's one of military history's most infamous surprise attacks. Both countries were not at war, and, in the past, had even enjoyed a good working relationship. Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, had actually conducted a tour of duty in Washington. In mid-1941, he began to strategize an attack that would cripple the US Pacific Fleet so the combined forces of Japan could quickly invade and secure the Philippines and the East Indies. With this much territory secured and the Pacific Fleet either destroyed or heavily damaged, Yamamoto thought it likely that America would stay clear away from a war in the Pacific. After the First World War, 70% of the US public had actually thought involvement in that conflict was a mistake. In 1940, 60% of the American public maintained that keeping out of actively fighting in the Second World War was the way to go. Yamamoto believed his attack would be so decisive as to give the US military a bloody nose, erode all public faith in the institution, and knock them out of the conflict for good. It was a bright, sunny Sunday morning on December 7th, 1941, when over the heads of busy sailors and staff at the various naval establishments across the Pearl Harbor base, there grew the increasingly loud drone of aircraft engines. 350 Japanese aircraft attacked out of that clear sunny sky, targeting installations and buildings, depots and hangars, but most importantly of all, the aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The American Pacific Fleet, or at least a good portion of it, was tied up idly and in peacetime. That notion of peace was shattered suddenly and violently. Bombs bracketed the battleships, rocked them at their moorings, and set them on fire. Smaller warships like destroyers had their bows blown completely off. Flames roared and seemed to touch the clouds hundreds of feet up into the air, and within minutes, the peaceful scene was turned into an earthly incarnation of hell. The Japanese propaganda film proudly shows the ships that were targeted and presumably sunk. The bluster and pride at the attack hides an uncomfortable truth for the Japanese. The key goal had been to cripple the US Pacific Fleet, but the 3 critical aircraft carriers were famously away on the open ocean and were never located by the attack force. Despite this, from the air and in between the enormous plumes of smoke, the sight of nearly 24 wrecked ships, burning and half sunken, must have been encouraging for the Japanese planners. With the port and its buildings still smouldering, the US Navy had to quickly take stock of their situation. To understand the sheer scale of the rescue and the salvage task ahead, we have to first review the damage and see just how many vessels had been hit. The American warships had mostly been moored in the harbour, with some in dry dock facilities undergoing maintenance. The Ford Island Air Base, in the middle of the harbour, had been hit hard, with many of its aircraft left burning and broken on the runway and in the hangars. Off the northern shore of the island, there had been a mixed group of warships. USS Tangier, a C-3 class cargo ship, survived unscathed. USS Raleigh, the light cruiser, had shot down 5 Japanese planes but was hit with a torpedo, and she listed badly in the water, although she was still afloat. She was easily pumped dry, sent for repairs, and back in action shortly after. USS Detroit, another light cruiser, had managed to get underway and knocked out several more Japanese aircraft. Despite a few strafing passes resulting in 1 injured man, she had survived unscathed and set out with the cruisers Phoenix, St. Louis, and 2 destroyers to hunt, unsuccessfully, for the Japanese attack force. Now, for the United States Navy, that was basically where the good news ended. Moored between Tangier and Raleigh was the massive Florida-class dreadnought battleship Utah. This 23,000-ton steel beast had been used as a training ship, but she was rocked by 2 torpedoes and began to rapidly flood. There was an orderly evacuation, but she rolled and completely capsized, trapping dozens of men inside her hull. On the southern shore of Ford Island, the situation was yet far worse. The area here was known as Battleship Row, where the heavy hitters of the US fleet would anchor. All of them were old ships, dreadnoughts from the First World War, which had been modernised in the years since. USS California was a Tennessee-class battleship of some 33,000 tons. She was hit with 2 torpedoes and a bomb, and settled on an even keel into the shallow water of the harbour, with 100 men lost. USS Maryland was a Colorado-class battleship. She was moored with the Nevada-class battleship Oklahoma to her flank. When Japanese torpedo bombers began dropping their payloads, this meant Oklahoma, and in fact all of the battleships outboard of those which were moored next to the island, had to bear the brunt of the warheads. Maryland took 2 bomb hits with 4 men killed, but survived the attack with little flooding. The Japanese mistakenly believed she had been sunk. On December 30th, Maryland went in for repairs, modernization, and she was back in action by June 1942. Oklahoma, outbound of her, was not so lucky. 2 torpedo hits amidships blew away whole chunks of her torpedo protection, a third penetrated the hull and flooded her machinery spaces. In around 10 minutes, the ship had taken around 8 heavy hits, and she rolled over onto her side, stopping only because her masts and superstructure had dug into the silt on the harbour's bottom. 429 of her men were killed. USS Tennessee and West Virginia, like Maryland and Colorado, had been moored in a pair as well, and the results were similar. Tennessee, a class-leading battleship, was moored inboard, and she hadn't suffered any torpedo hits at all. But the explosions of ships around her had set her decks on fire, and then dive bombers had attacked from above with 2 armor-piercing bombs, which were probably actually converted battleship shells. They plunged through her decks and a turret roof, although fortunately they did not detonate within the crucial and volatile main magazines. Burning oil from other ships began to creep towards her stern, so her crew did their best to keep it at bay by turning the ship's propellers slow ahead, thus fanning the burning liquid away behind her. Tennessee was trapped because around her the other battleships were burning and sunk. Outboard of Tennessee was West Virginia, another Colorado-class battleship. She took no fewer than 7 torpedo hits to her side and 2 armor-piercing bombs from above. A fire raged on her upper decks and the ship began to rapidly flood, but thanks to the efforts of Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, she didn't capsize but settled on an even keel. Fuel oil, burning on the water's surface, engulfed the ship, and she burned for a full day. Her captain was killed by a bomb blast from the nearby USS Tennessee, and 106 of his men were lost. Ricketts was the ship's gunnery officer, and when his ship was hit and began to flood, he rushed to gather a contingent of sailors to open tanks and counter-flood his vessel so she wouldn't roll. In his own words, he said, The ship was now listing so heavily that on the linoleum decks it was impossible to walk without holding onto something. I reached the third deck and went forward to the first group of counter-flood valves. Billingsley went aft and got a crank for operating them. I told Rucker to counter-flood everything on the starboard side until the ship was on an even keel. It was not long before the excessive list to port began to decrease. Rucker told me later that he had not previously received any orders to counter-flood, but he and Bobick decided that they should anyway, and they actually opened the valves to 2 voids. The final pair of moored warships on Battleship Row included the battleship USS Arizona of the Pennsylvania class and the repair ship Vestal. Vestal was moored outboard of the battleship providing maintenance. Vestal was hit with 2 bombs that had actually been intended for the battleships around her, one of which roared through 3 of her decks straight down before exploding deep in her holds. Her crew had got to work on their anti-aircraft and 3-inch deck guns, but then something cataclysmic happened. USS Arizona was moored inboard next to Ford Island. Now, the battleships moored like this had fared well in the attack, but Arizona was the tragic exception. One of those converted armor-piercing bombs plunged into her decks, crashing down deep into the ship. Now, this had happened to Tennessee too, but the bombs hadn't detonated, but on Arizona, they did. 7 seconds later, a plume of black smoke roared up through the ship's funnel as her insides suddenly and violently erupted in a massive explosion. Arizona's main magazines detonated with a flash that evaporated the ship's bow and showered debris over Ford Island and the other warships. Vestal's crew were blown overboard by the blast, her decks swept virtually clear, and fires put out by the shockwave. 1,512 men were aboard Arizona when she went up. 1,177 were killed in less than a second. She sank quickly on an even keel and came to rest, burning with thick smoke on the harbour's bottom, where the superstructure and forward tower sagging into the water. USS Nevada, a class-leading battleship, was moored far ahead of the others. When the attack began, it meant that she could actually get underway because she wasn't hemmed in. She was hit by a torpedo, but the flooding was mostly contained. Now, the sight of a damaged battleship limping away, her anti-aircraft guns blazing, marked her out as an important target to the Japanese aircraft. She was hit with at least 5 bombs, maybe as many as 10, which caused gas leaks, fires, and damage, but she still managed to shoot down 4 or 5 Japanese aircraft in the process. She came to rest on the soft harbour floor, beached just off Hospital Point to prevent her from totally sinking. Now, south of Battleship Row had been the dry docks, the Navy Yard, and the district headquarters. Pennsylvania, Arizona's sister ship, was in dry dock number 1, astern of the destroyers Cassin and Downes. The Japanese attempted an attack with torpedoes, but it failed. Bombs proved more successful. Cassin and Downes were badly hit, and they were set ablaze. The destroyers burned, and the fire spread to Pennsylvania, but quick-thinking dock workers flooded the dry dock to contain the flames, but they still spread into the magazines of the destroyers, and Downes went up. Pennsylvania received a bomb hit and some light damage, and the fire was eventually brought under control. She went to sea and was repaired, ready for action again a month or so later, but Cassin and Downes were stuck, wrecked, and burned against one another in the dry dock. Just over from those 3 had been USS Shaw, a Mahan-class destroyer. She was in a floating dry dock when she took 3 direct bomb hits which caused fires and opened her up to the harbour's water. Firefighting was unsuccessful and her forward magazines erupted too, blowing her bow and forward superstructure clean off and sinking her. Sotoyomo, a harbour tug alongside, was badly damaged in the explosion and sank as well. Ahead of the dry docked ships were the cruiser USS Helena and the mine layer Oglala. Oglala had been a passenger cargo steamship in the early 1900s, but then was converted to an auxiliary warship. She and Helena were moored in Pennsylvania's usual berth, and the Japanese attackers expected the battleship, a valuable target, to be there. To their surprise, that warship was in the dry dock, and the 2 smaller ships were in her place. A torpedo passed straight under Oglala and detonated on Helena's hull. The cruiser survived, but the smaller mine layer had her hull breached and she capsized in the water. Helena was bracketed by bombs, but survived the assault with 26 dead and 6 Japanese aircraft shot down. That was the butcher's bill. It had been a heroic display by the Americans. The warships, their crews taken completely off guard, had jumped straight to action stations and manned their guns, managing to bring down some 30 aircraft and damaging more than 70 others. But despite this valiant resistance, the fact was, the Pacific Fleet was now in a pathetic state of disarray, with a mixed lot of sunken, damaged, burnt out, and bombed ships all tangled up with one another, and many containing trapped men inside who were still alive, but entombed within the thick steel hulls. Something had to be done, and the Pearl Harbor salvage mission would soon begin, but first there had to be a rescue. Of priority was the removal of wounded men, many of whom had become overwhelmed by the strong fumes and dense smoke from the fires. But then, terrifyingly from the capsized hulls of Oklahoma and Utah, there came the sounds of tapping. Trapped men signaling for help with tools banging against the hulls from deep inside. Within the confines of the ship's hulls, crewmen tapped out an urgent message, but they weren't confident of a rescue. The air was thick with dust and particles, and the tiny compartments were pitch black as all the lights had died. One Oklahoma sailor, Stephen Young, later recalled that we had no knowledge that any attempt at rescue was even being made until the first sounds of the air hammer were heard as dawn came over the islands. For these men, the next few days would be a claustrophobic, terrifying waiting game. Using Morse code, the trapped men inside Oklahoma guided rescuers and cutting teams from the naval yard, armed with acetylene gas torches, and they got to work, attempting to sear their way through the ship's underside and plating. But burning their way through the hull armor, which was up to 13.6 inches or 34 centimeters thick, was virtually impossible. The thinner plating on the underside was more fragile, but using the acetylene gas torches to cut through the hull here risked burning up oxygen inside the ship, where the atmosphere was already incredibly hostile, with breathable air mixed with cork particles from insulation, gas fumes, and smoke. But even worse, almost the entire underside of the warship comprised fuel tanks that might combust if touched with flame from a torch. Compressed air and manual tools were used to break apart whatever plates they could. Fortunately, the working party had a copy of Oklahoma's general set of plans at hand, and it guided their efforts. USS Maryland's commander, Captain Kranzenfelder, assisted with the operations and described the efforts to help free the men. He said lines were rigged from the bilge keel at intervals along the bottom, telephone communication was established with the Maryland, an air supply line was quickly rigged from the Maryland to the Oklahoma, strainers were removed from main injections and overboard discharge in an attempt to gain access to the engine room. Contact was established with 2 men entrapped in the evaporator pump room through a small overboard discharge connection in the hull. Food and water were passed down to these men. From information obtained from these men as to their location in the ship, and with the aid of the booklet of general plans, it was possible to determine the best locations to cut access holes in the bottom of the ship. At 8 AM the next day, December 8th, 6 men were released from deep within the ship's underside where the plating was thinnest, and the work went on. Cutting in the wrong places could release trapped air, causing rapid flooding that would drown survivors, or even worse, fuel might be ignited, starting a flash fire. It was a dire job, but it had to be done. Banging sounds came from Utah too. A torch was obtained from USS Raleigh, and workers began to cut away at a lower part of the hull. Out of the hole popped fireman John Vason. It stayed at his post low down in the ship to help keep her lights burning. All up, from the 7th to the 9th, some 32 men were freed from the confines of Oklahoma's hull thanks to the tireless work of the naval yard men and their tools under the leadership of Hawaiian civilian worker Julio de Castro. Many of the 32 men were deep down in Oklahoma's hold, the radio room, the after steering room, the evaporator pump room, and the number 4 turret's ammunition handling room. The survivors owed their lives to the efforts of their comrades, as well as an air pocket within the ship's underside, but dozens of their mates were less fortunate. Trapped higher up where the plating was thickest, they were locked inside, with no chance of freedom. It was the same case with the other battleships too. USS West Virginia contained men trapped deep within its hull, but because she'd half sunk on an even keel, it was impossible to cut through the ship's thick belt armor in the side. Divers could be sent in from above to cut their way through, but an attempt on the Arizona had almost killed a diver, so this kind of operation was forbidden. Deep within the West Virginia's hull, 3 men were trapped, and they tapped out their pleas for help almost all day and night. The ship was placed under guard, and it was said during the night, for days and even weeks later, the tapping sounds continued from within until they finally quieted and then subsided altogether. With the rescue mission completed to the best of the Navy's ability, it became clear that 2,403 people were killed or missing, and critically, the Pacific Fleet's warships were unable to avenge their loss. Sitting scattered, burnt out, capsized and charred were the prized battleships, but early on it became clear that many of these weren't as badly damaged as the Japanese might have hoped. Just 1 week after the attack, salvage operations began. If the warships damaged at Pearl Harbor could be plugged, pumped dry and raised, they could be repaired and even put back into service to answer the challenge the Japanese Navy had set. On December 14th, Commander James M. Steele, the former skipper of USS Utah, was made commander of the Salvage Division at Pearl Harbor, and right away he had his work cut out for him. The Salvage Division's HQ was a simple shack near the waterfront, but from this humble base, a grand plan began to take shape. Working closely with all branches of the Navy, and especially the Navy Yard, the Salvage Division began to assign specific tasks to qualified officers. The idea was that each damaged or sunken warship was given a dedicated project officer, and then, under them were assigned designated specialist officers who would oversee very specific tasks. There was an officer assigned to all planned diving operations, an officer for removal and stowage of munitions, and an officer for all other ordnance. But the Navy knew it couldn't do it alone. Civilian companies came forward, especially civil engineering ones like the Pacific Bridge Company, who had themselves a good deal of experience in working with large concrete structures underwater, and their experience would prove invaluable for the task ahead. The first job of the salvage team was a surprising one. The attack on the harbour was over, but nobody knew if the Japanese would try again. The anti-air defences needed to be bolstered, and quickly, and there, in the harbour, lay battleships bristling with unused and submerged anti-aircraft guns. Divers suited up for the first time with their heavy helmet suits. Men at the compressor pumps on the decks were there to provide a constant flow of fresh air, and they got to work down below, unbolting anti-aircraft gun mounts from their positions and retrieving ammunition from the ready lockers and magazines by the hundreds. As this was done, the Salvage Division began to plan the much bigger job of repairing and refloating the warships which littered the harbour. The plan called for a kind of salvage triage. Of course, it was easiest to start with the ships which had received the lightest damage. Repairing them temporarily and making them seaworthy at the very least would mean the Salvage Division could send them under their own power to naval yards on the mainland US for proper repair and even some overhaul. First considered for salvage was USS Pennsylvania. She'd been in the dry dock with the destroyers Cassin and Downes, but had survived with some minor fire and bomb damage. Her propeller shafts and screws were realigned, and damaged anti-aircraft and secondary batteries were removed to be replaced with those from USS West Virginia, which was in a more seriously damaged state. Superficial shell damage and splintering was easily fixed by the naval yard workers, and on December 20th, the battleship was ready to make steam. She set out for San Francisco, went in for more permanent repairs, and was finished, ready for training and action on January 12, 1942, just over a month after the attack. Helena was the cruiser which had been moored in Pennsylvania's place, with the small auxiliary warship Oglala moored alongside and now capsized. Pearl Harbor's No. 2 dry dock was new and in a state of incompletion, but it was quickly fixed up by the experienced Pacific Bridge Company, and Helena was put into it, the first ship to ever do so. The torpedo, which had blown out the ship's side and capsized Oglala, had left a sizable hole. This was patched with welded steel plates and a new pumping system which was fitted that could deal with any ingress of water on her impending journey. Helena set off for permanent repairs at Mare Island Navy Yard in California on January 5th, and by the 4th of July, 1942, the cruiser was good as new and ready for training and then combat. With the 2 lesser damaged warships clear of the harbour, the Salvage Division's attention now turned to Battleship Row, where the pride of the Pacific Fleet lay battered and broken. These battleships each displaced around 30,000 tons, and patching them, refloating them and repairing them would be a Herculean task. It's early 1942. Only weeks earlier, Japanese aircraft had roared in and done terrible damage. The men salute their fallen comrades, hundreds still trapped inside the upturned hulk of USS Oklahoma with no chance of escape. For days and weeks, sentries guarding the wreck had tried their best to ignore the sounds of tapping coming from deep within the ship. But now, Oklahoma is silent. But she would not be left there forever. Instead, an audacious plan was in place to bring Oklahoma and all the other ships resting on the harbour bed back from the dead. Immediately after the attack on Pearl, the total number of battleship tonnage left sunk rounded out at no less than 122,600 tons of dead weight. 4 battleships were sunk completely, and 4 more were damaged. Arizona's magazine had erupted in a sickening cloud of flame and smoke that took over 1,100 lives. Oklahoma had been hit with so many torpedoes that she rolled onto her back with her propellers pointing clear at the sky. Nevada had managed to make steam and began to shoot down as many aircraft that she could, but the heroic flight did not go unnoticed, and as she moved for the harbour exit, she was smashed with 6 bombs and beached, smoking on the shore. Some smaller ships had it worse. USS Shaw's bow section was essentially gone. Cassin and Downes were shattered by bombs and fires. Oglala, the plucky little mine layer, had almost broken her back when a torpedo detonated against the cruiser Helena moored alongside, and she capsized at the wharf. Then there was the damage to facilities. The naval yards, the airfield, hangars collapsed, aircraft burnt out. All of this damage had to be seen to and reversed because Pearl Harbor, the once quiet little Pacific bastion of the US Navy, had suddenly found itself at the forefront of a vicious and cruel conflict. The United States was going to war. As American military planners began to organise their response and prepare for battles to come, back at Pearl Harbor, the monumental task of clearing up was already underway. A simple triage system was instituted that saw the wrecked and damaged warships ranked by priority. Overseeing the operation was Captain Homer M. Wallen, who took over from his predecessor in January 1942. It was obvious he had a huge job on his hands. Over 100,000 tons of battleship littered the harbour bottom. Officers were assigned to different ships as project directors and specialists assigned for specific jobs like diving and ammunition handling. Then the salvage division could properly get to its work. First, the less damaged ships were cleared out. USS Pennsylvania, the battleship, had escaped any serious damage and she steamed out under her own power. Then it was the turn of the cruisers Honolulu and Helena. With the least damaged ships cleared and the new dry dock rushed to completion by the Pacific Bridge Company, attention could at last be paid to the more damaged vessels. These wounded warships were tended to by order of priority. Obviously, a few would need to be left until the last because they were so badly damaged, but inspections showed that a few of the massive battleships could be patched and floated out from the chaos with a little elbow grease. USS Maryland had been moored inboard of Oklahoma. It meant that Oklahoma had eaten the majority of the torpedo hits and shielded Maryland from them, but Maryland became the target of dive bombers instead. 2 15-inch armour-piercing bombs, thought to have actually been made from converted battleship shells, had plunged straight through her steel deck plates. Although they detonated, fortunately her magazines didn't go up like Arizona's did, but a massive hole was torn in the ship's forecastle deck and a second bomb caused huge flooding in the bow. She dropped by about 5 feet into the water forward. Japanese pilots reported that Maryland was sunk, but they were wrong. Remarkably, the ship's damage parties had contained both fire and flood and then left to help other ships burning nearby, but Maryland still presented an issue for the salvage team and the Navy Yard crews. She couldn't make it back to the mainland in this state, but there was no dry dock big enough for her at Pearl. The solution was ingenious. A caisson, a kind of watertight chamber, was built around the hole where the bomb's detonation had ruptured the ship's hull bow plates. Once welded together, the caisson could be used to keep Maryland dry, while the ship's forward compartments were pumped. The hole was patched, and Maryland set out for Puget Sound, Washington, where she arrived only 23 days after the attack. Within 2 months, she was back at sea and ready for action. The Japanese had thought Maryland sunk, but for the rest of the war, the ship proved herself to be very much a living threat, pounding Japanese positions at Tarawa, Kwajalein Atoll, Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa, and more. Pearl Harbor's first damaged battleship was back in the fight. Next on the list for the salvage team was USS Tennessee. Like Maryland, she too had been moored inboard, closer to the shoreline, and had been spared the devastating impact of torpedo hits, but instead she too had been raked with bombs from above, which cut through her decks and her plating. Fortunately, their detonations were of little force. Some seemed not to have gone off at all. Tennessee's biggest problem, though, was that she was firmly stuck. When the bombs started falling, Tennessee obviously couldn't move anywhere since she was flanked on one side by fleetmate West Virginia and on the other side by the massive battleship mooring keys. West Virginia was hit so many times that she caught fire and sank to the bottom, wedging hard against Tennessee and forcing her against the keys. Then, as burning oil began to creep from other troubled ships nearby, Tennessee's crews had the clever idea of running the ship's engines slow ahead to fan the burning oil away. But even though the engines were turning, Tennessee didn't budge, and her mooring lines didn't tighten. She was clearly stuck fast. In the end, Arizona blew up and rained debris and fire all over Tennessee's decks. It looked like the ship was doomed to burn, so her magazines were flooded just in case. The fire was so hot from behind that the ship's stern plates began to buckle from the heat, and rivets even loosened. Through a Herculean effort, fires aboard were contained, but the oil burned on the water's surface for no less than 2 days after the attack. Penned in on all sides by ruined fleetmates, Tennessee had to wait her turn until Maryland was removed. Like a giant game of Tetris in reverse, this provided the battleship a path to be led out of her moorings, but the fact remained that she was still firmly wedged between West Virginia and the mooring keys. First, around 650,000 gallons of fuel oil, that's almost 2.5 million litres, were pumped out to lighten the ship, but still she wouldn't budge. It became clear that those huge concrete keys would need to come down if the battleship was ever going to move, so the Pacific Bridge Company got to work. Fortunately, with a background in bridge construction, they were well adapted for this kind of difficult task. On December 16th, the plan reached its crescendo. Dynamite boomed as the keys were blasted apart. At last, the trapped battleship was freed and nimbly slipped between the less fortunate West Virginia and Oklahoma. The Navy Yard men patched her ruptured hull plates and sent her on her way in a convoy with Maryland and Pennsylvania for Puget Sound and serious repairs. She too was back in action before the end of the year, and the ship would go on to see much heavy fighting for the rest of the war. As far as Battleship Row went, however, that was it for what could be considered easy wins. The remaining battleships were far too heavily damaged, and they would need extensive work to refloat. Arizona, Oklahoma, and Utah were so far gone that it was clear they could never serve again. There were two contenders for salvage though, USS California, sunk at her moorings, and then the other, USS Nevada, bombed out from above and beached in the sand. Clearly, Nevada would need a lot of work. In fact, many argued that she couldn't be saved at all. If an attempt at salvaging Nevada was to be made, it would clearly be a huge undertaking. Instead, for the time being, the Salvage Division's attention turned away from the battleships and onto the smaller craft which littered Pearl Harbor's facilities. If they could get some of these in action, then maybe, just maybe, they could pull off the impossible and refloat the massive battleships. USS Vestal was a prime target for repair because she herself was a repair ship after all and could be of some serious ongoing use to the operations. Vestal had been alongside Arizona when the battleship detonated. In fact, firefighting parties on Vestal's decks were blown clear by the sheer force of the blast. Aside from that, conventional 250-kilogram bombs had rained down on Vestal and pierced her heart. One detonated in a metal storeroom with no serious effect, but the second passed straight through and out the bottom, causing flooding. With the ship settling by the stern and Arizona a flaming wreck, it became clear that Vestal needed to get away from the carnage. Her skipper, Cassin had been blasted off the ship when Arizona went up, but he swam back to take control of the situation, famously declaring, "Lads, we're getting this ship underway." When he stepped on board, they cut the ship's lines with axes as the burning fuel oil began to creep closer and closer. With engines turning slow ahead, Vestal limped free as her superstructure began to burn and her flooding grew worse. First, she had anchored, but in the end Young decided it was safer to beach his ship. She gently came to rest off Aiya Bay. It had been a heroic effort on a day of heroic deeds, and Cassin Young was actually awarded the Medal of Honor for his efforts to save his ship and her crew. And Vestal, despite being tied alongside the most horrendously damaged ship of the attack, was never sunk. Instead, her crew had first got to work helping on other damaged ships of Battleship Row, freeing trapped men in Oklahoma and others. Then, finally, it was their own ship's turn. She was in a unique position. Her own men were skilled repairers of ships. They swarmed about her like busy bees, cutting away ruined steel or welding new plates. In less than a week, all the holes had been patched, compartments were pumped dry, and damaged bulkheads were welded watertight once more. The work of Vestal's crew meant the Navy Yard teams could focus on the other ships. But then, eventually, Vestal would need proper repairs below the waterline. She was no giant, so she could easily fit in the harbour's dry docks. She went in for permanent repair and was all fixed up and finished by February 18th, 1942. She went on to provide invaluable assistance to damaged US warships throughout the entire Pacific campaign. And not just damage from the enemy either, but freak Pacific typhoons that tore steel like it was paper. Then there was the USS Raleigh, a cruiser, one of the old-fashioned Omaha class. She was berthed near Utah at a mooring point usually used by the aircraft carriers, and so it was that she, an outdated design, and Utah, a training ship, came under furious attack from Japanese planes that had expected the carrier fleet. Utah had been devastated and rolled over, but Raleigh's crews were able to overcome the odds and save their ship. The old cruiser was rocked with blasts, first from 2 torpedoes which caused flooding and a list, and then from a direct bomb hit which again passed clean through and exploded below her keel. As Raleigh began to list, her men began to free loose weight on the high side to prevent a full capsize, while others manned the AA guns to keep the enemy planes at bay, destroying no less than 5. Attempts at counterflooding the ship essentially caused her list to ease, and a barge was brought alongside to stop her from rolling or sinking completely. Fortunately, tanks containing thousands of tons of aviation fuel weren't breached, and no major fire broke out. With no deaths among her crew, Raleigh had escaped serious harm, and her crew had done a mighty job of keeping their ship afloat, earning them a commendation. Like other lightly damaged ships, the majority of the repair work could be completed by the ship's own crew, along with the repair ships and tenders. Raleigh was patched up, entered the Navy Yard dry dock on December 22, and was back in San Francisco for full overhaul in February. The old girl lived to fight another day, and fight she did, bombarding shore positions and enemy merchant ships throughout the Pacific. Work continued on with the lesser damaged ships. The seaplane tender, Curtis, which had engaged a Japanese submarine during the attack and then kind of brought down an enemy aircraft after it collided with her tall crane. Bomb damage meant her repairs were only finalised in May 1942. Then there was USS Helena, a destroyer. The warship had actually made steam to patrol for submarines out of the harbour when she was attacked by dive bombers. The bombs were so destructive, even a near miss could be dangerous. Helm suffered damage from a bomb blast alongside that ruptured plating and caused flooding. The repairs were fairly simple and straightforward, and the little warship was back in action in no time. So far, the enormous workload undertaken by the men of the Pacific Bridge Company, the Navy itself, and the Navy Yard was bearing fruit. But there was an obvious reminder of the real difficulties ahead. Applying simple repairs to bomb holes and ruptured plating on destroyers was one thing, but sitting at the entrance to Pearl was the burnt-out, bomb-riddled hulk of USS Nevada. Every single ship that came and went had to steam straight past her. The same was true of California, Oklahoma, and Arizona. These massive ships were a source of pride for the men of the Pacific Fleet, but the sight of them, sunken and broken, had instead become a source of distress to the entire base. The destroyers, Shaw, Cassin and Downes, and the small vessel Oglala were all officially regarded as lost too because the damage was so severe. The same was true of the battleships California and West Virginia. They were so badly damaged that originally it was thought they could never fight again. They didn't know it at the time, but the Salvage Division, recently renamed the Pearl Harbor Repair and Salvage Unit, was about to perform a series of miracles, and these ships were going to return from the dead. USS Shaw was one of those vessels thought initially to be so badly damaged as to be a complete loss. She'd been at a floating dry dock when she took 3 direct bomb hits. The resulting fires spread out of control, and she had to be abandoned. At 9:30 AM, Shaw's forward ammunition magazines detonated in a brilliant flash. Everything forward of the number 1 funnel was effectively wiped out. The floating dry dock flooded and sank, and Shaw's bow sank with it, but remarkably her stern section remained afloat. It gave the salvage unit an idea. The bow section was cut off entirely, and the rest of the ship, virtually undamaged, was towed and moored at the nearby docks. Here, the Navy Yard men got to work on a strange project. USS Shaw got a new, temporary fake bow. It would mean that the ship could steam under her own power out of Pearl and over to the west coast of the USA for permanent repairs. It didn't matter that her bridge had just been wiped out. The ship could be steered from her emergency after steering compartments just above the rudder, and a simple platform was constructed atop her tripod mast where officers could coordinate her maneuvering. By the end of January, the new bow had been fitted, everything was rigged up, and the USS Shaw was ready for her remarkable voyage. As she left the harbour, there was cheering from the crews as they watched this first, seriously damaged ship set to sea once more. It was a minor miracle because Shaw seemed to have returned from the grave. By the summer, Shaw was fully rebuilt and ready for action once more. In August, not even a year since the attack, Shaw returned to Pearl Harbor once again, looking a brand new ship, and she was very warmly received indeed. The sight of USS Shaw gave the salvage crews renewed hopes and vigour, but it couldn't be denied that the task ahead was still enormous. They were incredibly skilled workers, divers, riveters, carpenters, but there were some jobs that were impossible to pull off. USS Cassin and Downes had been in dry dock together, and repeated bomb hits and fires had caused magazine detonations similar to Shaw. But for these two destroyers, the result was far more destructive. Cassin's hull and keel were warped beyond repair. The whole ship hogged upwards in the middle by as much as 17 inches or 43 centimetres. Downes was similarly twisted and buckled, with her bow twisted high and her stern twisted low. Repairs got underway, with holes being patched or plugged, pumps taking oil and water out, and cutters removing bent and buckled superstructure, funnels, and deckhouses. At first, it looked like Cassin and Downes might live to fight again, like Shaw had, but there was intense discussion around the viability of this. There could be no doubt that even with corrective action, the two destroyers would only ever really be suited to low-impact escort work or simple patrols. But ships' hulls back then were actually relatively simple and cheap to make. It was the engineering machinery that was complex and expensive, and inspections proved that Cassin and Downes' engines were in fine condition. The decision was made to scrap the two ships but preserve their machinery so that the engines could be fitted to new destroyers instead. Over 1,000 tons of machinery, pumps, turbines, fans, and many more were removed, restored, and carefully catalogued piece by piece. Most of the original hulls were scrapped through 1942, and by early 1944, the new ships were ready, appropriately named Cassin and Downes. In fact, both vessels' undamaged 37-ton stern sections, which still bore their original nameplates, had been ceremoniously kept and grafted onto the new hulls. They both went on to fight against the enemy that had sent them to the bottom of the dry dock that December 1941, with many battle stars and medals won between them. With Cassin and Downes being tended to, the Pearl Harbor Repair and Salvage Unit was now also faced with their most challenging jobs yet, the 6 battleships that were still sunk or beached around the harbour. These would not be ordinary repair jobs. The ships were monumental in their scale. West Virginia was herself about 22 times larger in displacement than Cassin or Downes. The first contender for salvage work became Nevada. She was beached off Hospital Point at the entrance to the harbour, and while her damage was severe, she wasn't a shattered hulk like Arizona, nor was she overturned like Oklahoma or Utah. Nevada had fought like a lion. Early on, she'd been hit by a torpedo, but steamed out under her own power. Japanese pilots attacked her furiously and scored 5 bomb hits almost all at the same time. Fire ravaged her superstructure, and then Nevada came gently to rest, intentionally beached to prevent a full sinking. Her bow was in deeper water, while her stern touched the shore. Her usual draft was around 28 feet, but now the water rose nearly 2 stories higher. The damage was incredible. Photographs show her forecastle deck buckled and bent from bomb hits and fire damage. It seemed incredible that a ship so badly ruined could ever be refloated or put into service again, even despite the impressive work done to Shaw, Cassin, and Downes. Captain Homer Wallen, the salvage officer, remained hopeful about Nevada. He thought her older style of reciprocating steam engines would be more easily salvaged than other ships' turbine electric machinery, but others weren't so sure. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, commander of the Pacific Fleet, thought Nevada would never sail again. He had toured the harbour but found the destruction overwhelming, despite having read all the reports and briefings beforehand. "This is terrible, seeing all these ships down," he had simply said. It's easy to see why Nimitz thought Nevada was a total loss. It was up to the salvage unit to prove him wrong. Immediately after the attack, Nevada's flooding began to make her settle deeper into the water until her stern came to rest on the bottom with a slight list to starboard. Now, this was actually optimal for the salvage crews, who used anchors and lines to hold her in that position until the ship could be patched and refloated. By securing the ship in place, it meant there was no risk of her being carried off by a high tide, only to sink in deeper water and block the channel. In early 1942, crews got to work on their biggest job yet. First, the ship would need to be patched. Bomb damage forward in the hull was covered with simple wooden patches that could be driven hard up against the plating with bolts. As the compartment inside was pumped dry, the water pressure itself would then act to hold the patch in place. Other areas of damage along the hull needed more specialist attention. Skilled divers, some of the best in the world, got to work down below in their hard hat diving suits, welding over holes and fixing ruptured plate seams. They came largely from the Pacific Bridge Company, support vessels, the Destroyer Rapid Repair Unit, and even Nevada herself. It was stressful, dangerous work. The ship could shift slightly and send an unprepared diver over the side where water pressure could crush his entire body up into his helmet. That had actually happened to a diver on the Empress of Ireland back in 1914 who fell only 65 feet or 20 metres deeper. This incredible danger was faced every day through the course of no less than 400 successful dives and 1,500 hours spent underwater cutting, drilling, excavating, and dynamiting. No diver was injured or lost in the fight to get Nevada seaworthy. Soon, it became clear that a huge torpedo hole needed a patch big enough to cover an area of about 48 by 25 feet, that's some 15 by 8 metres. Now this was in particular quite complex, because it was a part of the ship's hull where a torpedo bulge was installed, and matching the curvature of the bilge would be tricky. Fortunately though, the overturned hull of Oklahoma provided the perfect template-making opportunity because the ship was the near-identical sister to Nevada. The patch was made to fit Oklahoma, and by nature it would therefore fit her sister. But this proved too large even for the skilled salvage crews to handle. Attempts at fitting the patch proved futile, and even after a month of hard work, divers at last gave up. Totally unbeknownst to them, the projection from the hull, blown out by the explosion, was preventing the patch from seating properly and creating the seal it needed to fit. In the end, it was decided that the large hole could simply remain because the internal bulkheads would be reinforced from the inside and then relied on to prevent any wide-scale flooding as the ship was slowly refloated. With patches in place, the moment of truth had arrived. Would Nevada float again? All remaining oil had been pumped out of her tanks and the ship's weight lessened by removing guns, munitions, heavy equipment, and anything that might keep her fixed to the harbour's silt. With a mechanical roar, the pumps burst to life and slowly, Nevada began to be pumped dry, bit by bit, compartment by compartment. This was not an easy job. If certain compartments were drained faster than others, the ship could capsize completely. Hoses were rigged to suction pumps of all sizes in a complex arrangement, and slowly, Nevada began to rise again, a steady fountain of water bubbling out from the pumps over the side of the ship. As the compartments were pumped dry for the first time in nearly 3 months, teams were sent in to clear them of any contaminants or remnants of fuel, ammunition, or even organic materials like food and paper. It was a hellish scene. The mixture had become like a thick stew which coated every bulkhead and deckhead. In particular, there was found an enormous store of what had once been fresh meat, but by that point was entirely rancid. In other compartments still lay the bodies of their fallen comrades, badly decomposed and requiring identification. They were sent off to the Navy hospital. This wasn't just unpleasant work, it also proved deadly. On February 7th, Lieutenant James Clarkson was in a confined space in the steering engine room when he was overcome by gases. A machinist mate who rushed to his assistance was overcome too, and later died in hospital. Analysis showed that the gas was likely hydrogen sulfide, completely odorless and the result of the decaying organic material in water like the paper or the meat. The salvage unit learnt their lessons the hard way. A lot of this kind of work was completely uncharted territory. The loss of these 2 men was a blow, but it couldn't detract from the eagerness of those who had toiled and suffered so much already to get the job finished. From then on, water samples were rigorously tested for dangerous levels of gases, and they would be detected. Salvage men were clad in thick rubber boots and overalls with breathing apparatus like gas masks as they worked inside the refloated ship, hosing away all the oil and grime. To help the men, ventilation was provided with portable fan units, and rudimentary lighting was also rigged up as well since the ship's own fittings were, of course, non-functional. That's not to say they were all finished for good though. The ship's wiring was actually found to be in fine condition. It just needed to be dried out. Machinery was taken out for repair and salvage. This was likely thanks to a wonder substance called Tectil, the kind of rust preventative. It dried out the components and applied a protective layer of film which would prevent any more corrosion. From then on, Tectil became the main weapon for the salvage unit on all the remaining ships like Nevada. In fact, they were so successful at this kind of work that about 95% of Nevada's original electrical machinery was totally repurposed and saved. On February 12, 1942, the men of the salvage unit beamed with immense pride. They had done it. Nevada was again afloat, a triumphant sight for all of those who'd worked so hard on her the previous weeks. Even Chester Nimitz must have been shocked by the sight as the ship prepared to be taken under tow for dry docking. This itself was no easy feat. If the ship broke her lines, she would not be able to correct her course, and after all that hard work, she could end up sinking or blocking the channel. Everybody held their breath as the small boats wrestled Nevada under their control, and they brought the ragged battleship successfully to dry dock number 2, only recently completed, and the only dock large enough for a ship of Nevada's size. Watching proudly over the whole operation was Nimitz, who had thought the ship to be a complete write-off. He was happy to be proven wrong. Incredibly, the work to restore Nevada was successful. The hulking wreck was transformed by an army of men from the naval yard into something resembling a functioning warship once again. But of course, her first voyage would need to be back to the US mainland for proper, permanent repair. The Navy Yard workers did their best to get the ship's galley in working order, her machinery and her electrical fittings functional, and the bomb holes patched. Once in dry dock, the magnitude of the damage done to the battleship was clearly evident. No wonder the divers couldn't fit that patch on. On April 22, not even 5 months after the attack, Nevada steamed out in a convoy under her own power for Puget Sound Navy Yard. The ship Nimitz and others thought was done for emerged from that yard in October completely rebuilt, a formidable, modernised battleship with a crew keen on vengeance. After a stint in the European theatre, including supporting fire at D-Day, Nevada rejoined the Pacific Theatre for the invasion of Iwo Jima, where her massive guns hurled shell after shell at the enemy. Nevada anchored just 500 metres, only 600 yards offshore for maximum destructive effect. It was a triumphant moment for a warship that had been considered doomed for the scrapyard and which had been the place where 52 men had fallen. Now, as Nevada's guns roared with flame and fury, their sacrifice could at last be avenged. The USS California had been moored in berth F3 at the very front of Battleship Row, some distance away from her fleet mates, when the first Japanese planes buzzed in to begin their torpedo attacks that fateful December morning. While this distance afforded the battleship protection, should one of her comrades suffer a similarly catastrophic magazine detonation as the Arizona had, the berth far away meant that she was almost immediately singled out for destruction by the Japanese flyers. In the opening moments of the attack, at around 8:05 am, 2 torpedoes slammed into the port side of California below her impervious armor belt, the first striking forward near her bridge, while the second exploded further back almost directly under turret number 3. Both of these impacts ripped massive holes in the ship's hull and opened her up to the sea, but the flooding should have been stopped by a watertight subdivisioning. Bad luck stepped in to ensure that California sank. Most of California's extensive underwater protections and watertight compartments were rendered useless because the battleship had been left in what the Navy called Condition X-ray. Instituted in the lead up to an inspection, Condition X-ray stipulated that watertight compartments and manholes were to be left open to allow for easier navigation of the battleship's interior by senior officers and crew. But on the morning of December 7th, the men of California had little chance to transition their ship to a more secure condition, and so the battleship's critical internal defences could not save her as she came under blistering air attack. Though California's crew had not been able to seal the battleship's watertight compartments, they had immediately rushed their battle stations, breaking out ammunition and heroically opening fire with 50 caliber machine guns and the ship's complement of 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The men fought back valiantly against their attackers, hurling as much ordnance into the air as possible in a desperate attempt to save their ship. But for all their effort, the brave crewmen quickly found themselves running out of ammunition. The impacts from the torpedoes and the resulting flooding had knocked out California's power. The vast quantities of water rushing into her hull had contaminated the battleship's vast network of fuel lines that supplied her generators, and as a result, the hoists that supplied the topside 5-inch guns were soon out of action, leaving the topside gunners with almost nothing left to shoot at the seemingly endless formations of incoming Japanese bombers. It must have been intolerably frustrating because the crew had the guts and the guns to fight back, but they just didn't have the ammo. With the ship now listing dangerously to port, California's officers quickly issued orders to counter-flood in order to bring her back on something of an even keel. This quick thinking prevented California from capsizing completely in the immediate aftermath of the torpedo attack, but as fresh formations of bombers moved in, the ship and her men were not out of the woods. Roughly 25 minutes after the torpedo strike, California shuddered under the impact of several near misses from the bombers. These substantial explosions in the water right next to her buckled and bent the hull, causing even more uncontrollable flooding through the open compartments. but just after 8:45 AM, one of the Japanese bombs finally found its mark. The bomb, weighing over 1,700 pounds or just over 770 kilograms, and modified from a 16-inch naval shell, punched straight through California's deck amidships and exploded deep inside, killing 50 of her crew instantly and setting off one of her anti-aircraft ammunition magazines. The resulting fire spread rapidly, and the blaze was totally uncontrollable, since the loss of power had rendered the battleship's vast array of firefighting equipment inoperative and totally useless. California was out of the fight. During the desperate combat, scenes of incredible heroism had played out. 3 medals of honor would be awarded to California's crewmen in the aftermath of the attack, and tragically 2 would be awarded posthumously. Robert R. Scott, a machinist's mate in the forward air compressor room, refused to leave his battle station as a horrid amalgamation of churned up seawater and oil rapidly flooded the compartment that supplied vital compressed air to the 5-inch mounts. His comrades begged him to leave, but Scott refused, doggedly saying, "This is my station, and I'll stay and give them air as long as the guns are going," before the rising water eventually consumed him. Further back, Ensign Herbert C. Jones demonstrated remarkable courage, rescuing his fellow sailors from the noxious smoke filling California's corridors before taking over and directing fire from one of the ship's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. As the flooding from the torpedo hits knocked out the power to the ammunition hoists, Jones wrangled together a group of men to manually haul the 55-pound, 25-kilogram shells out of the magazines themselves and up to the guns. The hit from the 1,700-pound armor-piercing bomb left him mortally wounded, and with fires spreading, Ensign Jones used his last breath to warn his comrades to keep away moments before the 5-inch ammunition magazine went up in a fireball. The only Medal of Honor recipient from California to survive the attack was gunner Jackson C. Farris. He'd been rushing to his position when one of the torpedoes impacted directly underneath, launching him right into the compartment's overhead ceiling. But despite being dazed and in severe pain, Farris worked desperately to pass ammunition to his gun, setting up another human chain to pass the ordnance up from the magazine. And when the order to counterflood came through, it was Farris who rallied his fellow sailors and directed them to make sure the orders were carried out. 2 times he was rendered unconscious by the choking fumes and the smoke, but each time he resumed his efforts to keep up the supply of ammo that was desperately needed topside, while he also braved the rapidly flooding compartments to save his shipmates. In those sort of conditions, inside claustrophobic steel compartments and rooms, every fibre of your being is screaming at you to get out and save yourself, but Farris and his comrades were able to keep their mind on the job and get it done, saving hundreds of lives in the process. Despite these men's gallant efforts, California was in dire straits, with fires spreading rapidly and her perforated hull flooding uncontrollably. Her men did what they could. But as if to make matters worse, from back along Battleship Row, a blazing inferno of burning fuel oil was steadily creeping its way along the surface of the water. Thick clouds of noxious black smoke billowed into the air and choked the brave men still left on California's deck as the flaming oil poured out of the ruptured hulls of the other stricken battleships and threatened to engulf them. With fires now all around and their beloved ship sinking out from under them, the crew were forced to finally abandon California and make for the relative safety of Ford Island. The scene that greeted them must have been simply shocking, the sight of vast plumes of smoke filling the sky as they rose up from a sea of burning oil, while their fellow sailors desperately fought for their lives amidst the carnage. It would be forever ingrained in their minds. But there was little time to dwell on it. Hurriedly, the men gathered whatever firefighting equipment they could in a determined effort to save their own battered ship. But by the time they returned, California was already listing 8 degrees over, and the massive dreadnought gradually settled into the muddy harbour bottom and came to rest. Recovery of the California was going to be a big job. The ship had suffered even more substantial damage than Nevada had. The 2 torpedo holes in her hull, along with the buckling and rupturing from the near misses, meant that she could not just be patched and refloated. California had also sunk in deeper water than Nevada, nearly 40 feet or about 12 meters. It meant the water around California reached all the way up to her main deck, and her charred and blackened superstructure seemed to rise up from the water almost out of nowhere. The salvage teams were going to have to pull out all the stops in order to accomplish what to them must have seemed like a minor miracle. In the days and weeks after the attack, inspection had determined that the greatest threat to California's salvage was the water that was sitting over her hull and submerging her. In order to save the ship from the scrap heap, the men were going to have to hold Pearl Harbor itself at bay. And while that may have seemed like an impossible task, that's exactly what they set out to do. Lacking the time to raise her properly up, engineers devised a clever solution. Using 4-inch thick wooden boards and sturdy angle iron, massive cofferdams were constructed around California's hull. Anchored to a shear line, that is, the curve along the top edge of the ship's hull, the dam in effect served as a vertical extension of the hull itself, like a wooden wall that jutted up and kept water off the deck. 2 of these impressive structures were built, one for the stern section, while another, possibly more important cofferdam enclosed her forepeak at the bow, which had been blown open by one of the near misses. Though impressive, the cofferdams presented challenges of their own. The first problem was that the wood itself was inherently buoyant, and bolting large slabs of it to the side of a sunken battleship was not an easy task, especially when you consider that the divers tasked with installing them were encumbered by clumsy helmet diving suits, covered in thick oil that still sheened on the surface of the harbour. Secondly, it was feared that as pumping efforts began to dewater the decks, the surrounding seawater would press inward now against the unsupported inside of the cofferdams and collapse the entire structure from the outside, flooding California once again and leading to even further damage. To combat this, a series of heavy-duty timber braces, similar to the kind used to shore up ships waiting to be launched on the slipway, were added to the interior walls of the dams that would hold back the immense pressure of the water from the outside. Once the cofferdams were in place, pumping began, the clearing of California's decks having the combined effect of lightening the ship and revealing the damage done to her top side during the attack. With their decks finally free of water, divers could turn their attention to the crippled giant's ravaged hull. It was quickly discovered that the California couldn't simply have her watertight compartments sealed and the water pumped out, as had been done with Nevada. The combined damage to her bow section below the waterline from the torpedo and the near-miss bomb was considerable, with a near 40-foot, or 12-metre long, and in places 10-foot tall gash being blasted out of the side of the ship. With the option to simply button her up and pump out the water not being viable, and with the immense success of the cofferdam solution, it was decided to carry over the principle of the topside structures into the new versions of the underwater patches that had failed to work with Nevada. Like oversized bandages placed over massive wounds, these new patches were constructed from the same 4-inch thick wood planks and angle iron that had been used topside. Each of the 16-foot sections of timbering had to be curved at the bottom perfectly to account for the shape of California's hull near her bilge section, while the tops extended well above the ship's waterline. Massive floating cranes were used to carry the patches over from Pearl Harbor's coal dock, where a team of skilled carpenters worked tirelessly. The structures were then lowered down against California's side and sunk using heavy lead weights to counteract the wood's natural buoyancy, before finally being bolted to the crippled warship's hull. The act of bolting a wooden patch onto a battleship proved to be a monumental task in and of itself, since divers were first tasked with cutting away twisted bits of metal rent apart by the force of the explosions before, and then drilling holes into the ship's side into which they would mount the heavy-duty bolts needed to support the patch's immense weight. But the divers' struggle did not end there. Once the bolts were inserted, they would have to traverse the flooded, labyrinthine corridors of the battleship's interior to place a similar heavy-duty nut on the other end of the bolt threads and screw it shut to properly hold the patch against the hull. It was a very daunting job. California's cramped and winding passages stretched pitch black, apart from what scant illumination the gallant men's lights could provide. The danger of this task is difficult to overstate, so is the bravery of the men who carried it out. But for these men, the notion of simply leaving the ship sunk in the mud or breaking her up for scrap was just too much to bear. California and the other battleships stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th were cherished vessels, their presence instilling a sense of deep pride in all the servicemen of the Pacific Fleet. To see them in such a state, burnt out, bent, broken, and sunk, filled each man with an indomitable will to do whatever it would take to bring them back, and they pressed onward. To ensure that the patches would adequately shore up California's hull before the refloating, gaps between the timber and the still hull had to be made watertight. The nut and bolt arrangement wasn't good enough. Here again, another ingenious solution was implemented. To seal the patches, long, thin canvas sacks filled with oakum, a hemp or jute fibre soaked in pitch, were pressed into the gaps. Once packed full and soaked in water, the pliable material was referred to as pudding, thanks to its malleability, although some men joked that the puddings more closely resembled sausages. But regardless, after being wedged in between the hull and the timber, The weight of the water that had earlier threatened the viability of the cofferdam solution in the first place now actually worked for the salvage team, since it pressed the oakum sacks firmly enough into the gaps to form a very effective watertight seal. Admiral William Furlong, impressed with the creative solution, compared it to a mason jar's rubber gasket. With the great patches finally bolted in place and the canvas and oakum puddings sealing the gaps, divers were once more called on to brace the interior face of each patch, similar to what had been done on the cofferdams above. Like with those, it was feared that once the water was pumped out of California's hull, the weight of the water on the outside would cave in the wood keeping her afloat and send the dreadnought crashing right back down to the bottom. And so, once again, the brave men were called upon to traverse California's flooded interiors, only this time dragging along cumbersome timbers and heavy steel bracing, along with all the tools and equipment required to actually build the bracing to keep the patches intact. With the patches braced and the cofferdams keeping the sea at bay, the colossal floating cranes were used to remove every major heavy bit of equipment that could be taken off to lighten the load. The battleship's huge main armament, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and even her towering basket masts. It was all taken off in an effort to lighten the lumbering monster as much as possible before attempting to refloat her. Finally, on the 21st of March, after 4 months of exhausting, grueling, and dangerous work, the pumps were turned on and California began to rise from her muddy grave. But almost immediately, there were problems. See, California hadn't only sunk in deeper water than Nevada, she'd also gone down on an uneven patch of sea floor. This meant that as water was pumped out and the ship began to lighten, the irregular positioning caused her to develop at one point a terrifying 20-degree list. It took 3 agonizing days for California to come up from the bottom, with pumping continuing all the way until April 5th, and that's when the unthinkable happened. At around 1:15 PM, with California once again floating, finally, and waiting for a dry dock to open up, another explosion rocked the ship. With a thunderous boom, the massive bow patch over the near-miss bomb damage blew out. Thousands of tons of seawater reflooded the spaces that the men had worked so hard to restore. The ship lurched under the added weight, and her bow dipped alarmingly back down into the water. Immediately, the men aboard sprung into action, rigging up 2 pumps and shutting as many doors and watertight hatches as they could. Their quick thinking saved California, as the water ingress from the loss of the bow patch would have been enough to put her back on the bottom in minutes. But with the pumps running and the hatches and doors closed, California stayed afloat, and crucially, at a shallow enough draft to actually make it into the dry dock, a fact which saved the poor divers from having to perform another miracle. With the ship saved, everyone's thoughts immediately turned to what had just happened. Of course, sabotage was immediately suspected. Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Fleet's battleships were still prime targets for the Japanese, and even before the war had started, it was feared that Hawaii's significant population of ethnic Japanese would side with their ancestral homeland in the event of war, and would either spy or commit acts of sabotage. And now, with the significant explosion aboard California, it appeared that those fears might have some merit. But after a thorough investigation, no evidence of sabotage or any kind of explosive compounds were discovered. What was found, though, was that large amounts of fuel oil vapor, along with a high concentration of hydrogen sulfide, a gas generated from all the decomposing food, paper, and other organic materials, had created an extremely volatile mixture that had somehow found an ignition source and erupted into an explosion powerful enough to mangle deck beams and damage bulkheads. The salvage team got lucky, as even with the patch blown out and California's forward compartments now flooded again, the battleship was just barely light enough to clear the entrance to the dry dock. At last, on April 9th, 1942, USS California was gently towed into dry dock number 2. The 2 pumps still attached to her deck were gushing water as they strained to keep the indomitable giant's bow afloat. With the gates closed behind her and the water steadily pumping out, crews descended on the battleship to prepare her for the long voyage back to the United States. Like with Nevada, the interior of California was a scene of indescribable filth and ruin. During the initial salvage, over 200,000 gallons, or some 757,000 litres of fuel oil, had been siphoned out of her, but despite this incredible volume having already been removed, the oil still clung to every surface from the 3rd deck up, and below that, thick, gluey mud had cemented itself in and around the bomb and torpedo damage. Heaps of decomposing food, paper, clothing, and bodies all had to be removed. The mess inside California was so bad, in fact, that after 4 months of grueling work performed by hundreds of men, only about half of the ship had been reclaimed from the filth. There were also all the human touches of life from before the tragedy as well. A band member, L.B. Lukenbach, had taken his sheet music aboard but was forced to evacuate the stricken ship as the attack went on. Now, all these months later, Lukenbach, who was lucky to have survived, was able to go aboard and find it. Poignantly, one of the sheets was the score for the Stars and Stripes Forever. As the muck was finally cleared away, scores of metalworkers turned their attention to the battleship's ruptured hull. Twisted and bent steel plating was cut away to make way for new sections to be welded in place. Beams were removed, straightened, and then reinstalled. It was found that much of California's damaged hull plating could simply be heated, rolled back into shape, and then reattached. While this work was performed, the extensive topside damage was repaired as well, with the many holes in California's deck and superstructure being patched over with new plating. But not all of this work that needed doing was going to be straightforward. Unlike Nevada, California used a turbo-electric propulsion system. Where Nevada used the steam generated in her 12 massive boilers to drive turbines geared to her propeller shafts, California relied on steam-driven turbines generating electricity for an impressive set of 4 electric motors to push her immense bulk through the water. And being submerged in Pearl Harbor's briny water for several months hadn't done them any favours. But under the supervision and guidance of representatives from General Electric, 2 of the massive motors were removed and completely rewound. Miles of copper wire had to be carefully spooled in order to provide the dreadnought with enough of its own power to limp its way across the Pacific back to Puget Sound, Washington, where the rest of her machinery could be overhauled. This massive effort in rebuilding California's beating heart was described by the men from General Electric as the largest job of this sort ever performed in the field. While all of this was going on, dockyard workers set to work stripping the battleship's interior down to almost nothing. Furniture and fittings were removed, along with the ship's ventilation equipment, while every ounce of wiring was ripped out to make way for newer, more up-to-date systems and switchboards. Compartments, which had been stripped down to bare metal during cleaning operations, were now repainted and restored. And finally, on the 7th of June 1942, USS California left the dry docks at Pearl Harbor on her way to mainland USA to complete repairs and refit, the Revenant battleship departing Pearl on October 10th after being reunited with her main 14-inch battery. It must have been an emotional sight for the hundreds of men and women who had made it happen. There was California in a coat of fresh blue paint steaming out for the open ocean, a true moment of pride for the teams that had worked day and night to bring this mighty warship back from the dead. But few newsreels chatted as California made her way out of Pearl Harbor. The departure had to be strictly secret, lest Japanese submarines or aircraft intercept her en route and send her back to the bottom. Steaming once more under her own power, California arrived back in the US to undergo permanent repairs and receive a huge refit and entire overhaul. When she emerged from dry dock in January 1944, the once aging dreadnought was now a lethal and modernised warship. Sporting a new dazzle paint scheme, California bristled with 40 brand new Bofors anti-aircraft cannons and just as many 20mm Oerlikon guns as well. She was stripped of her outdated basket masts and also had her armour increased, turning her into a veritable floating fortress. Returning to the fleet in May that year, California would go on to deal out healthy servings of revenge, unleashing her fury on the Japanese forces at Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. But this would not be all, as on October 24th, 1944, USS California would have the distinct honour of joining her fellow Pearl Harbor Revenants Maryland, West Virginia, and Tennessee, along with the New Mexico-class battleship Mississippi, at the Battle of Surigao Strait. This task force laid waste to their opponents, sinking the Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, along with the destroyers Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo. California's guns roared and sent over 60 big shells downrange, crippling Yamashiro. Meanwhile, Mississippi's salvo would prove to be the last time one battleship would ever fire at another in anger. But California would not emerge from the war unscathed. On January 6, 1945, while supporting the invasion of the Philippines, she was struck by a kamikaze, the resulting explosion killing 44 of her men and injuring another 155. The damage required her to return to the United States once more for repairs, but she still wasn't done. The old battleship returned just in time to participate in the end of the Okinawa campaign. She'd go on to support the American occupation of Japan in the wake of the Empire's surrender. The much-revered battle wagon sailed into the home waters of the enemy that had once crippled her, now stronger and more deadly than ever. Through late 1941 and into 1942, the ships had been slowly righted, pumped, repaired, and sailed off one by one. Each had suffered in the attack, but not equally, and the damage varied from ship to ship, much of it deadly. Each salvage played a crucial role in educating the division for their next job, and the charred hulk of the USS West Virginia would again present a unique challenge. She was the most severely damaged battleship to be saved. Moored outboard of the Tennessee in berth F6, the USS West Virginia found herself in a deadly predicament similar to her fellow battleship, Oklahoma, because she was moored directly in the firing line of the horde of Japanese Kate torpedo bombers that swooped in low to attack. During the rapid onslaught, West Virginia acted as a shield for the battleship Tennessee. She shuddered and shook from the near simultaneous impact of no fewer than 7 Japanese torpedoes. The warheads ripped the mighty warship's side open as if it was made out of aluminum foil. A further hit would open up her bow section to the sea, while yet another one further aft would blow the massive dreadnought's rudder clean off and hurl it off the now sinking ship. But, despite the horrific damage at the outset of the battle, the crew of the West Virginia still fought valiantly. Even as fires spread rapidly both aboard the ship and along the surface of the water around her, the ship itself began to list to a terrifying angle. Her guns continued to hurl ordnance up at the enemy planes still circling above. To get a sense of just how sudden and rapid the attack came to West Virginia, we turn to the testimony of Commander R.H. Hillcotter, West Virginia's executive officer and her most senior officer to survive the attack, who wrote in his report after the battle, "I was in my cabin, just commencing to dress, when at 07:55 the word was passed, away fire and rescue party. This was followed about 30 seconds later by general quarters. At the same time, 07:55, the Marine orderly rushed into the cabin and announced, 'The Japanese are attacking us.' Also, just at this time, 2 heavy shocks on the hull of West Virginia were felt. It seemed as if these shocks were somewhere forward on the port side. By this time, I had reached the quarterdeck, and the ship was beginning to list rapidly to port. I proceeded along the starboard side until just forward of number 3 turret, when there was a 3rd heavy shock felt to port. The planes on top of turret 3 caught on fire, and there were flames all around the turret top. The quarterdeck sentry informed me that the captain had already gone to the bridge, so I remained aft to assist the extinguishing of the fire around turret 3 and on the quarterdeck. There was another heavy explosion at this time that threw me flat to the deck. During all this time, the ship was continuing to list to port, and at the time of this latest shock, I should estimate that the list was about 20 or 25 degrees. I called to the sound power telephone watch to tell Central to counter flood, but do not know whether or not this word got through. Luckily though, Hillcotter's words had gotten through to someone. Lieutenant Commander John S. Harper heard the orders and rushed to carry them out. His actions in starting the counter-flooding undoubtedly saved the ship from capsizing in the same way Oklahoma had, which had too suffered a devastating barrage of torpedoes and went over like a dog might roll in his sleep. It was only the rising water in his compartment that forced the brave officer to finally abandon his post. In the melee, several bomb hits were also scored on West Virginia, which only added to the chaos breaking out all over the embattled vessel. One struck the foretop, all the way at the top of the mainmast, piercing through the thin, unarmoured section with ease before smashing down potentially as far as the second deck, where it exploded and ripped apart sections of the ship's superstructure. Another bomb struck West Virginia right on the top of her number 3 turret. The armor-piercing projectile sliced through the armoured roof of the turret, but by some miracle, it failed to detonate. Instead, the bomb broke up inside the turret and potentially saved the ship from a shattering magazine detonation. However, bomb and torpedo strikes were only the first of West Virginia's problems. The massive oil fire, fed by the ruptured fuel tanks of her fleet mates that surrounded her, soon engulfed the ravaged battleship, and while Nevada and California had been lucky enough to avoid the worst of those devastating fires, West Virginia found herself in the heart of the blaze. For 30 hours, the once mighty dreadnought burned, the heat from the fire reaching temperatures high enough to warp and buckle solid steel deck plating along an astonishing 3/4 of her entire length. Even some of her internal bulkheads deep within the hull were damaged from the incredible heat. The fires were made worse by the fact that West Virginia was almost fully fueled, her cavernous tanks sitting at about 70% capacity on the morning of the attack. It was rapidly becoming clear that the damage control crews, despite their heroic efforts in saving the ship so far, just couldn't suppress an inferno of that scale. And so the order was given reluctantly to abandon ship. Surviving crew and officers leapt into the oil-coated water, some making their way to the neighbouring Tennessee to aid their embattled comrades, while others swam for Ford Island to join other survivors there in helping the wounded and those fighting the fires from land in any way they could. Salvaging the burnt-out and blasted open giant would be no easy feat, though by now, after the successful raising and recovery of the Nevada and California, the men of the salvage team were not going in blind. Initial dives on the hull revealed the extent of the underwater damage, and it became very quickly clear that a far greater patch than those used on the California would be needed in order to refloat West Virginia. And there would certainly be no getting lucky like they had done with Nevada, which had been refloated without its so-called big patch. Most of the battleship's port side was blasted open, so it was decided that one massive, nearly 150-foot-long patch would be constructed in sections and installed along the battleship's midsection where the damage was the most severe, while a second, smaller patch would be used to cover the damage from the forward torpedo strike. But for the hit towards her rudder at the stern, it was determined that this kind of damage could actually go unsealed, that simply closing the watertight doors and the bulkheads and isolating the damage would be sufficient to get her off the bottom. Using their experience, gained from months of grueling work on the California, it was decided to again employ the highly successful cofferdam style of patch now on West Virginia. With a plan in place, the experienced work crews set about in earnest. Patches were constructed in smaller 13.5-foot sections, which could then be lowered into the water with the assistance of heavy lead weights and placed next to those that had gone before. Though quickly, divers ran into a problem. Since the damage to West Virginia's hull above her armoured belt was so devastating, there just wasn't enough material left on which to bolt the massive cofferdam structures to begin with, and what was left could hardly be considered battleship hull anymore at all, thanks to the twisting and the mangling from all those violent explosions. To remedy this, and give something to secure the patch sections too, the team employed a very simple but brilliant solution. Heavy-duty 10-inch wide H-beams were bolted vertically to the warped, but intact, armoured belt. Spaced every 8 feet, the beams could then be braced horizontally to provide a sufficiently strong frame to which the patches could then actually be mounted. But this wasn't the only challenge faced by West Virginia's salvage team. The size of the giant main patch meant that the same techniques used on the California to seal the gaps between the cofferdam and the hull just wouldn't work. On that ship, smaller cofferdams had been employed to seal off individual torpedo hits, which had been sealed with long canvas sacks filled with pitch-soaked jute fibre called puddings. Once waterlogged and stuffed in between the hull and the patch, the simple devices acted like a kind of gasket that prevented water from flooding back into the vessel when she was pumped out dry. On West Virginia, though, since the damage was one giant hole caused by multiple warheads detonating in roughly the same area, it was decided instead to use concrete to seal up the bottom of the battleship's massive bandage. Using the Tremy method, a technique in which concrete can be poured underwater using vertical pipes, over 650 tons of a special underwater concrete mix was poured in. With Tremy pipes installed every 10 feet, the special mix developed by the Pacific Bridge Company for constructing dry docks was poured to depths of around 4 feet along the bottom length of the entire patch. With the hull sealed, the men could then set about lightening the massive dreadnought in preparation for refloating. 800,000 gallons, or over 3 million litres of heavy fuel oil was pumped out of West Virginia's tanks, while over 40,000 gallons, or 150,000 litres of loose oil, was skimmed out from her interior and off of her decks. Ammunition, food stores, and fittings were also stripped, while 2 Japanese bombs that had failed to explode were also carefully removed and sent away for evaluation. The ship's food stores included thousands of pounds of beef and dairy products, the removal of which was a particularly horrendous task considering the battleship had been submerged in oily salt water and left to bake in the beating Hawaiian sun for months. But the men were at least somewhat aided by the fact that before work had even begun, divers had descended into the horrid filth to open all of West Virginia's remaining intact internal doors so that clean seawater could be circulated through the hull to remove some of the mess and clear out pockets of stagnant water and toxic gases. During the salvage efforts, 66 bodies belonging to West Virginia's fallen crew were discovered and removed for burial. Most of them were in a state of advanced decomposition, their remains left unrecognizable to their comrades after months of entombment within the ship. Hauntingly, there was considerable evidence that at least some of the men had survived for weeks, trapped inside the dark rooms of the sunken dreadnought, barely surviving within tiny air pockets. Deep within the pitch-black flooded compartments, the men would have used whatever they could to pound desperate messages, begging for rescue. But tragically, none came. There was simply no way for anyone outside the stricken behemoth to hear them, and even if they had, rescue for those poor souls would likely have been impossible. Many were found clinging to the tops of steam pipes near the top of the engine room where the air pocket had once been. In total, 106 of West Virginia's men tragically met their end during the attack. Finally, on the 12th of May 1942, after months of yet more exhausting, dangerous work, West Virginia began to rise from her watery grave. Though almost immediately it was found that the water being pumped out of West Virginia was nearly equal to the amount flooding back in. Even though the massive cofferdams were working as intended, the dreadnought's hull was in such a sorry state after that immense beating it had taken that a combination of loose rivets, small shrapnel holes, burst seams, and other random damage had turned West Virginia's hull into something more resembling Swiss cheese than a proud warship. So once more, the gallant divers were sent down with their tools to patch up the myriad holes and rents in her side, and 5 days later, on the 17th of May, the water levels within the battleship finally began to fall. But, as the water was pumped out, a serious concern began to arise that once the battleship was fully refloated, there was a risk that she might suddenly capsize and be lost once more to the harbour bottom, but this time for good. With so much of her hull blasted apart, the ship's weight was terribly skewed to one side. As the water was pumped out of the massive void where her hull used to be, the growing air pocket meant that the battleship was far more buoyant on one side than the other. There was also the fear that with all of the water removed, the immense weight of the sea would cave in the massive cofferdam and everything would be lost. One patch had been blown out on California when a mix of fuel vapor and toxic gas had built up and ignited, but luckily on that ship, crews were able to seal off the damaged section and keep the battle wagon afloat. If a similar incident happened to West Virginia, and her giant patch suddenly failed, no amount of heroic effort would save her from crashing right back down to the bottom. Anxiety began to mount, because when West Virginia was refloated, there was just no dry dock space available for her, meaning the huge warship was forced to sit idly by and wait, while the immense pressure of the water pressed in on her fragile patches. Even though the cofferdam was braced from the inside, just like had been done on California, the length of time the structures were subjected to the crushing force of the sea caused serious concern. The issue was that California was still occupying dry dock too, and she couldn't be moved until her repairs were completed. West Virginia simply had nowhere to go. In an attempt to mitigate the risk, several spare patch sections were held in reserve aboard one of Pearl Harbor's massive floating cranes, while teams of men were stationed aboard the battleship to operate the sea valves for counter-flooding should the hull become breached. At least then, it was hoped that West Virginia would settle on something of an even keel and the team could just try to refloat her again, instead of rolling over like Oklahoma. It wouldn't be until June 1942, nearly a month after the pumps were switched on, that West Virginia could finally be towed into the safety of the dry dock. Thankfully, the reserve patches weren't needed because her sturdy cofferdams and bracing successfully held back the sea and allowed the massive dreadnought to stay afloat. Now, finally, sealed in Pearl Harbor's cavernous dry dock, the horrid ritual of cleaning the battleship's interior of all that toxic buildup of rotten organic material and thick oil could begin once again. Even with the great volume of the sludge already removed, huge amounts still clung to every surface and it all needed to be cleared away. And while those with that unenviable task set about their work, and crews of skilled yardsmen tended to the ruined hull, the job of breathing some life back into the old dreadnought began in earnest. Like California, West Virginia was a turbo-electric ship, Her power plant consisting of 4 mighty electric motors supplied with the electricity from huge turbines, fed by steam from a series of 8 massive Babcock and Wilcox oil-fired boilers. These motors contained miles of intricately wound copper wire, and after being submerged for months in Pearl Harbor's briny waters, these impressive machines would need to be completely stripped down and have every inch of their wire carefully and precisely rewound. But thankfully, owing to the fact that such a massive volume of loose oil and debris had been removed from West Virginia's interior during the salvage work crews had been able to descend into the depths of the stricken giant to remove loads of sensitive machinery and equipment from the harsh salt water far earlier on than on California. In fact, before the battleship even entered dry dock, the preliminary steps of removing her massive generators and main propulsion motors had already taken place, as had a thorough cleaning of the engine room. This, coupled with a generous coating of the rust preventative product Tectil, meant West Virginia's vital machinery was able to be recovered in far superior condition when she entered dry dock than California's had been. While this work was being undertaken, the Herculean task of rebuilding the dreadnought's shattered hull could also begin. But as the water was gradually pumped out of the dry dock, the true enormity of the job that lay ahead became apparent. With the massive sections of cofferdam removed, a gaping, twisted maw of rent and broken steel greeted the teams of yardsmen and metalworkers. Nearly the entire port side of West Virginia had been blown apart by all those hits from Japanese torpedoes. Even her hefty 13.5-inch or 34-centimeter thick armoured belt was bent and cracked in several spots. Parts of the ship that hadn't taken bomb or torpedo damage had still been affected by the raging fires that burnt unchecked for 30 hours, even after the last Japanese planes had departed. That immense heat had buckled and warped her steel both inside and out, and with the vast extent of the damage, massive sections of her hull and armour would have to be cut away and either straightened out or outright replaced. In all, it took hundreds of skilled workers 3 months to restore West Virginia's hull and make the giant warship watertight and seaworthy once again. With dry dock work completed, West Virginia was removed and left pierside, while further work to the battleship's interior spaces was carried out. Wiring was stripped and renewed, walls and ceilings repainted, and furniture and fittings were all replaced. It wouldn't be until May 1943 that this work was finished, and finally the mighty battleship could set out for Pearl under her own power once again and make for the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. Here, like Nevada and California, West Virginia would undergo final repairs and receive an extensive overhaul and modernization. She would emerge from the yard in July 1944, a completely new ship, far deadlier and even more effective than before. From there, West Virginia rejoined her comrades in the Pacific Theater, exacting revenge at Mindoro, Lingayen, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa had also taken part in the Battle of Suragawa Strait. And after Japan's surrender, she was called upon to help to support the massive occupation efforts. But during her combat career in the Pacific, the Japanese would have one last crack at the old girl when a kamikaze struck her during operations off Okinawa. Fortunately, the damage was relatively minor, and she was able to remain on station and continue her duties. West Virginia would finish the war participating in Operation Magic Carpet, the mighty dreadnought now acting as a ferry for thousands of American veterans returning home to their families and loved ones after a bitter, long, and hard-fought war. By 1947, the aging warship was finally brought out of active duty and decommissioned after 24 years of exemplary service. And in 1959, the mighty West Virginia would finally meet her fate in the scrapyard, the oxy torches of the yard workers completing that final destruction the Japanese armed forces had never achieved. So far, all the battleships had been returned to service. What remained was essentially a graveyard of overturned and shattered warships. At Battleship Row, the upturned hull of the Oklahoma sat conspicuously in view as the men toiled away on the other ships. The side of her propellers sticking helplessly out of the water, while her superstructure lay smashed against the harbour bottom, was a stark and painful reminder of what had happened on the day of Infamy. Hers would be the largest and the most difficult salvage of them all, and the effort would require the skills and expertise of some of America's best and brightest engineers. On the morning of the attack, Oklahoma had gone to battle stations just like the others around her, her men racing topside, breaking out 5-inch shells and belts of .50 caliber ammunition. She had fought back valiantly at first, but she was astride of Maryland on the outer mooring, and her long, thick hull presented a perfect target for Japanese Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Almost immediately, a heavy barrage of torpedoes smashed into her side, ripping her armoured hull apart like wrapping paper. In fact, the exact number of torpedoes that struck the Oklahoma has never been definitely verified, but it's thought that between 5 and 7 torpedoes struck during just the opening moments of the attack. It was an unprecedented, devastating blow. Almost immediately, Oklahoma took on a massive list as water thundered into her broken hull. Within minutes, the battleship had heeled way over to a frightening 35 degrees and continued to slip further and further. It was quickly becoming obvious that the mighty warship just wasn't coming back, and the order to abandon her was promptly issued and passed to the crew as they desperately scrambled out of hatches and gun ports to escape the rapidly advancing flooding. Men poured over the rolling side of the battleship, plunging into the water, and some swam to the safety of Ford Island, while many made for the Maryland moored alongside to assist her gunners in the fight against the marauding Japanese aircraft that still filled the sky. Those who landed on the island quickly set up a collection point for casualties, and sent those who arrived uninjured to help in putting out the rapidly spreading oil fires. But as her superstructure settled into the mud, more than 450 crewmen found themselves trapped within the upturned hull, fumbling around in the pitch dark as a horrid mix of water and spilled oil quickly overtook the few remaining air pockets. Frantically, the men picked up whatever they could, desperately banging on the battleship's hull with wrenches and hammers, tapping out SOS signals in a last-ditch attempt to call for help. Stuck inside the sunken hull, the men trapped had no way of knowing if rescuers had heard their SOS at all, and without a way to effectively talk with the outside world, they were forced to sit in the choking darkness and wait. But as it turned out, someone had heard. Julio de Castro, a civilian working at Pearl Harbor's naval yard, heard the sounds of clanging from within the capsized hulls. Knowing this could only mean one thing, he quickly gathered his fellow yard workers and set about trying to open up the Oklahoma's hull to free the trapped sailors. Working with Commander E.P. Cransfelder from the Maryland, who had managed to find a booklet of general plans for the two near-identical sister ships, De Castro and his team worked with pneumatically powered chipping tools fitted with heavy-duty chisels to break into the capsized hull. De Castro and his men worked through the night, the still-burning Arizona lighting up their work area as they desperately toiled to rescue as many men as possible before their oxygen ran out. After hours of backbreaking work, one by one, the beleaguered sailors of Oklahoma that could be reached were pulled out of their would-be tomb. When one of these sailors told De Castro that several men were trapped in an adjacent compartment, the yard worker simply replied, "We'll get 'em out." For an hour, fellow dockyard worker Joe Bulgo worked on the bulkhead in the rising water. He made 3 cuts before calling out, "Look out for your hands, boys!" And then he set about smashing the wall the rest of the way down with a sledgehammer, freeing 10 more men. All in all, 32 of Oklahoma's trapped sailors were rescued by De Castro and his brave crew of yardsmen. It had been a magnificent, heroic effort, but tragically, for hundreds more men, the battleship would be their tomb. Its upturned hull serving as a giant steel sarcophagus, but not a permanent one. In the wake of the rescue attempt, attention eventually had to be turned to the ship itself. It was clear that Oklahoma was in a very sorry state, though the full extent of the carnage was unknown since her damaged sections were largely inaccessible thanks to either being blocked by the ship itself or buried in the mud. With her hulk resting firmly on the bottom, salvage teams left Oklahoma to rest for the time being. There was little hope that the old girl would ever see service again, and with California and Nevada providing far more hopeful prospects for salvage, workers' efforts and Pearl Harbor's limited resources were committed to see these ships restored instead. But with her corpse occupying a valuable berth on Battleship Row, and her sunken superstructure representing a navigational hazard to any ship traversing the channel, by mid-1942 the decision was finally made to right her. Getting Oklahoma onto an even keel was an even greater undertaking than the salvage of either California or Nevada, and once more the skilled men of the Pacific Bridge Company were vital in its success. It was immediately obvious that the previous solutions of cofferdams, patches and pumps employed on both California and Nevada were woefully insufficient to lift Oklahoma's bulk off the bottom. The battleship was effectively upside down. She'd need to be put right first before any attempt at refloating could be done. But just how on earth do you right a 27,500-ton, 583-foot-long ship stuck in the mud? Well, the brilliant minds of the Pacific Bridge Company got to work, and their expertise devised a spectacular system that would see Oklahoma pulled right side up. It involved a series of 21 massive righting frames, each attached to the exposed portion of the hull, heavy-duty steel cables were run across to the conveniently nearby Ford Island, where they connected to an array of staggeringly powerful winches using electric motors taken from the tram cars in Honolulu. In theory, as the winches got to work, the cables would slowly be wound up, lifting Oklahoma's exposed side over and righting the ship. But with over 27,000 tons of steel to shift, it was a very dicey proposition. To ease at least some of the strain on the whole arrangement, as much fuel and ammunition as possible was removed from Oklahoma, while divers ventured inside the wreck to close as many doors and hatches as they could, to allow air to be pumped into undamaged sections and create pockets that would lighten the ship even more. Thousands of tons of crushed coral was even placed under Oklahoma's bow to provide something for the ship to roll against as she was righted, since her bow had gone down in a patch of the same sort of soft mud that had complicated the salvage of the California. With the system designed and set up within months, on March 8, 1943, the winches were switched on, and ever so slowly, the once mighty dreadnought was hoisted upright. It looked, from the air, like a toy battleship half sunk in a pond, but the reality was that this full-sized, massive battleship was being lifted upright by the clever system of winches and cables that had been custom designed for the job. The only thing was that progress was painfully slow. The lifting operation would continue all the way from March until mid-June, with pauses being taken to re-rig cables and make adjustments and repairs as necessary. And as the battleship slowly crept its way onto an even keel, the catastrophic extent of the damage was gradually revealed. Once more, a series of huge patches were constructed to seal the rent-open hull, while large air-filled pontoons were strapped to her sides to aid her buoyancy. The lessons learned from all the previous salvages proved invaluable, as the now experienced teams set to work refloating the battered warship. At last, in mid-June 1942, they'd done it. Oklahoma was upright and afloat. It had been an engineering triumph, but it still presented a tragic sight, the once proud battleship reduced to little more than a dented, rusted hulk, but the job had been done. Now she needed to be stripped and repaired, and the remains of her crew had to be found and properly interred. Oklahoma would slip into Dry Dock 2 on December 28, 1943, her broken hull just barely clearing the entrance. Here, crews set about sealing up the rents in her hull, cutting away mangled steel and replacing it with welded plates to make her watertight once again. Cleaning crews again began the unenviable task of removing the by now all too familiar buildup of rotten sludge and oil coating every inch of her interior, but as they worked, they uncovered the exposed bones of more than 400 of their fallen comrades, their bodies fully decomposed after a year and a half underwater. This grueling, nightmarish task was only lightened by the knowledge that Oklahoma did not have to be as thoroughly cleaned as the others, since she was by now well and truly destined for the scrappers. Hundreds and hundreds of tons of machinery were stripped out of her. Boilers, computers, generators, guns, engines, almost her entire superstructure. By the end, all that was left was a bare hull dotted with 4 big gunless turrets. With her hull patched up, Oklahoma would sit out the rest of the war in Pearl, the once indomitable warship waiting her turn for the scrapyard. In 1946, she was finally sold to a shipbreaking firm, but a year later, while under tow to San Francisco to meet her fate, Oklahoma took matters into her own hands. During a storm, the dreadnought broke her tow lines and sank, plunging into the cold, crushing depths of the Pacific, and her location remains a mystery to this day. USS Arizona was moored directly behind USS Tennessee on December 7th, 1941. Like her fleet mates, Arizona had immediately opened up with her batteries of anti-aircraft weapons against the incoming Japanese planes, with orders coming down to secure the battleship's internal watertight bulkheads and compartments in preparation for the attack. As crewmen and officers rushed to their stations, amidst the unfolding chaos, bombs began to strike the aging warship. As many as 8 would hit the Arizona, but one hit in particular would carve the ship's name into the pages of history. At 8:10 a.m., a massive 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb sliced through Arizona's deck right next to her No. 2 turret. The bomb penetrated down through her decks before detonating deep within the battleship's interior. The enormous blast ignited her black powder magazine. The resulting explosion in turn set off the much larger smokeless powder magazine, and the devastating explosion that followed ruptured and blew out the dreadnought's hull and blasted her forward sections to pieces. Incredibly, it was captured on film camera. Her sturdy hull and stalwart armour was simply no match for the immense release of destructive energy from within. Arizona's massive turrets, her conning tower, and most of her superstructure then just collapsed in on the ruined decks. There was simply nothing left beneath them to support all that massive weight. With her imposing mainmast slumped forward, Arizona, by now a pitiful and shattered sight, sank further and further into the now oil-laden waters of Pearl Harbor, her once mighty and imposing figure reduced to a broken wreck. 1,177 of Arizona's crew were killed in that enormous blast, almost half of the total numbers of fatalities suffered that morning. Among the dead were Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Arizona's commanding officer Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg. Ensign Douglas Hine, one of the 334 survivors, and one of the sailors whose testimony on the morning's events was preserved, later wrote, "I left the junior officers' mess at general quarters. As I went to the boat deck, I noticed that some of the starboard anti-aircraft guns were firing. Then I went up to the signal bridge. I looked around and saw that there was nothing I could do. The only people up there were the captain, the quartermaster, and myself. Suddenly, the whole bridge shook like it was in an earthquake. Flames came through the bridge windows, which had been broken by gunfire. We three were trying to get out the port door at the after end of the bridge during all this shaking, but could not." Hine survived by scrambling out a door that was blown open and flung himself down the bent and twisted ladders of the superstructure, which were almost red-hot to the touch, before he made it to the safety of a launch. For 2 whole days, Arizona burned, the light from the inferno illuminating the upturned hull of Oklahoma as teams of civilian dockyard workers desperately toiled to free sailors trapped inside. Her corpse was still burning when the carrier Enterprise pulled in, the ghastly light bathing the deck of that flat top as her crew watched on in silent horror. Arizona was a total loss. The catastrophic damage done to her hull and decks ruled out any hope of raising her, even for scrap. But the wreck still contained valuable weapons and materials, and so a partial salvage effort was undertaken that saw the ship's aft turrets stripped of their guns, while her remaining magazines were emptied of all the ammunition and powder. The turrets themselves would later be lifted off the sunken deck and given to the army to be used as shore defense batteries on Oahu. Throughout 1942, sections of the battleship's exposed masts and superstructure would be gradually cut off and hauled away, eventually leaving the wreck in the condition that she currently rests in, the ruptured hull still bleeding black, oily tears into Pearl Harbor's vibrant blue waters. Due to the condition of the wreck, most of the bodies of her fallen crew couldn't be recovered. Those that were pulled from the mangled remains of the once proud dreadnought had been burnt beyond recognition. The rest of the fallen men were declared by the Navy to have been buried at sea with the wreck of their ship, still serving as their tomb. Today, a monument sits atop Arizona's wreck, opened in 1962. The site welcomes thousands of visitors from all over the world and serves as a somber memorial for the men who lost their lives when the battleship went up. But also present in Pearl Harbor's turquoise waters is the mighty USS Missouri, the last battleship ever built by the United States, whose decks saw the final surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945. Today, her tall, swooping bow sits facing the wreck of the Arizona in recognition of the old dreadnought, the 2 ships symbolizing the start and the end of the war. The mighty Mo, as she is known, will now watch over and guard her fallen ancestor and the over 900 of her men still interred within. But on the other side of Ford Island rests another chilling reminder of the human cost of the war. The wreck of the USS Utah is not as well known as that of Arizona, and her memorial is nowhere near as grand. Even in life, her role in the Pacific Fleet was not nearly as glamorous or prestigious as her fleet mates, yet her story, and that of the men who served and were lost aboard her, is no less important. Commissioned in August 1911, USS Utah was the second and final ship of the Florida class, and she was the oldest battleship present at Pearl Harbor the morning of the attack. Moored between the cruiser Raleigh and the cargo ship Tangier, Utah was totally exposed as waves of torpedo bombers came in low on their runs. Unlike the ships moored on the other side of Ford Island, Utah wasn't technically a battleship anymore. In 1931, she had been stripped of her main armament of 12-inch guns and converted for use as a target ship. She was subsequently redesignated BB-31 to AG-16. But though she was stripped of her main armament, Utah still bristled with a wide variety of anti-aircraft guns. As part of her role as a training ship, Utah was equipped with these weapons to train new gunners. But sadly, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Utah would have little chance to put her remaining weapons to use. In the opening moments of the attack, 2 torpedoes would rip open the former battleship's hull. The resulting flooding quickly overwhelmed the aged ship's compartments, and she began to roll. There was no time to counteract the rapid flooding like they had done with West Virginia. She was simply going too quickly, so the order to abandon ship was given, but most of Utah's men made it to safety as the ship settled upside down on the harbour bottom. Tragically though, 58 of them would not make it out alive, and 54 still remain entombed within the wreck. That number would likely be one higher if it weren't for the efforts of machinist S.A. Szymanski from the USS Raleigh, who heard tapping coming from the upturned hull. After assembling a team, Szymanski scrounged a cutting torch and set about searing open the hull plates. Szymanski and his small volunteer team succeeded in rescuing fireman 2nd Class John B. Vasson from his would-be grave. It wouldn't be until 1942, though, that preliminary dives would be conducted to assess the state of Utah's wreck. It was found that the ship was stuck firmly in a muddy patch of sea floor and was in a stable enough condition to begin efforts to retrieve all those valuable items from within the upturned hull. With torches in hand, holes were cut into the exposed sections of Utah's hull, and divers set about removing thousands of rounds of valuable anti-aircraft ammunition. It was slow going because the men traversed the upturned ship through all those claustrophobic corridors and twisted metal. Even in compartments that had been pumped out, danger still lurked around every corner because buildups of lethal hydrogen sulfide gas threatened to kill any man not wearing a respirator. By February, thanks to the increasing danger of venturing deeper and deeper into the wreck, efforts to retrieve anything of value from Utah were stopped. Utah, once a proud battleship that had taken part in the American occupation of Veracruz and ferried President-elect Herbert Hoover around South America, was left to rust in Pearl Harbor's salty water for a full year before efforts to even salvage the old dreadnought were picked up. It was hoped that after the successful righting of the Oklahoma, the operation on Utah would be a far simpler affair. The salvage division already had the hardware left over from the job, along with the valuable experience gained from hoisting that ship back onto an even keel, and so the work began of attaching those huge righting frames that had once hauled Oklahoma up from the bottom to the hull of Utah, while once again Ford Island itself would see an impressive array of winches and powerful electric motors set up to pull another giant battleship out of the mud. It took 13 months to get everything set up and ready for the big pull, but unfortunately, it would all be for naught. See, Utah was wedged so deeply into the sticky, gluey mud of the harbour bottom that the more the winches strained and pulled on the towering frames, the deeper and deeper she sank. It was like a truck that was bogged. No amount of force that the salvage team could muster would be enough to pull this stricken giant out. So, on March 15th, 1944, all efforts to salvage Utah were finally halted for good. It was those final dives onto her hull to make sure she wouldn't roll anymore that would mark the end of the long, arduous salvage operation at Pearl Harbor after that infamous day that had taken place 2 years prior. All in all, over 5,000 dives were performed during the Pearl Harbor Salvage Division's efforts, with more than 20,000 hours spent underwater in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Many times, these gallant men worked in total darkness, feeling their way around underwater in the suffocating murk, going off nothing more than their memory of the ship's blueprints or whatever hints could be passed down through a makeshift telephone cable into their helmets. All the while, they struggled with heavy, cumbersome suits and airlines that threatened to be sliced by all those countless sharp edges of the vessel's shredded interiors. Untold thousands of hours had been spent by yet more men topside, encumbered by respirators and gas masks as they braved the poisonous fumes and unspeakable conditions inside the battered giants. Often, they found themselves up to their waists in the rotten, oily sludge coating every surface inside the stricken ships as they recovered the remains of their fallen comrades and restored wrecks bound for the scrap heap back to fighting condition. The Pearl Harbor attack sank 5 battleships, including Utah, and seriously damaged 4 more. Cruisers, destroyers, all other kinds of ships. It equaled a toll that saw hundreds of thousands of tons of steel sunk to the bottom of the harbour. And yet, thanks to the incredible efforts of this brave salvage work team, all but 2 ships were brought back up, and nearly all were back in service before the end of the war. Japan's military had made a fatal miscalculation, that Pearl Harbor would be decisive enough a blow to knock the US out of the Pacific War for good. Even though the Japanese attack had been devastating, the Imperial flyers had comprehensively failed in their mission to put the base itself out of action. Even as the wrecks of the aging battleships smoldered, Pearl Harbor could still largely function as a naval installation. When the carrier USS Enterprise pulled in less than 48 hours after the attack, she was able to refuel and resupply and be back out to sea in just 7 hours, since the Japanese had failed to destroy Pearl's crucial stores of fuel oil and provision storage facilities. Then America came back in force with a whole new generation of battleships, and crucially, a fleet of immensely powerful aircraft carriers that handed Imperial Japan defeat after hard-fought defeat. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack had been Isoroku Yamamoto. In real life, he probably never actually said or wrote that famous quote attributed to him, something to the effect of, "I fear we've awakened a sleeping giant." That came from the 1970 movie Tora Tora Tora. In truth, though, he was depressed by the attack. That it had happened without a formal declaration of war was regrettable in the extreme. Maybe he saw the writing on the wall. Either way, he was forced, over the coming years, to watch his own fleets turn to scrap metal themselves, and a generation of bright young Japanese men consigned to the depths. In the end, he was hunted down and killed by American fighter planes while touring his forces in the South Pacific. There are some unusual ironies surrounding the Pearl Harbor salvage story. The attack had been a decisive, irrefutable demonstration of air power, and that the end of the age of the battleship had come. Arizona had been torn apart by one particularly nasty bomb hit. Nevada, even though she was underway and with guns blazing, had been left a smoking wreck. Clearly, this was a new age, and yet countless man-hours were poured into bringing back the ships that had been sunk, ships from a very different time. The attack dragged the USA, Australia, the United Kingdom, and many more countries into conflict with Japan that would see over 6.5 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and more killed, countless others wounded and scarred, and then untold millions of civilians killed as well. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor with the Kate torpedo bomber and the Aichi D-3A dive bomber, but within 3 years, America would be striking back on Japanese cities with flying monsters that could carry a payload more than 18 times as heavy each. Of course, the end result was a kind of existential weapon so horrible, we're still grappling with the ramifications of its use today. But none of this detracts from the efforts of those hundreds of men and women who toiled to bring the ruined ships back from the dead at Pearl Harbor. Much like the war itself, it was a job that just needed doing, no matter how awful. Vice Admiral Homer Wallen, who'd been placed in charge of the Salvage Division back in January 1942, summed it up best. He said, "Enough cannot be said in praise of the salvage crew. They worked hard and earnestly. They soon saw that the results of their efforts exceeded the fondest hopes of their supporters, and they were urged on by their successful achievements." Today, it's only the 2 ghostly wrecks of the Arizona and the Utah that remain as a testament to the incredible efforts of this gallant team of determined people. The others have long since been consigned to the scrap heap or, in USS Nevada's case, used and destroyed in Cold War nuclear testing. Their useful lives were spent serving their nation, and now they exist only in memory, though one to be revered and honoured. In the decades since, many of the men who braved the horrid conditions and grueling hours have since passed as well. And though they may be gone, their memory and the incredible story of how they salvaged Pearl Harbor will forever remain as a lesson in what humans are capable of in the face of overwhelming odds.